Clara Whitfield stepped onto the gallows platform wearing a white wedding dress. Morning wind lifted the veil like a surrender flag. Below the rope stood a stranger in chains. Elias Boone. A ranch hand nobody in Dry Creek claimed to know. The hangman tested the knot. Clara raised a trembling hand. "Stop. By law. That man is my husband now." Gasps moves through the crowd. Sheriff Dalton's hand froze above the lever. Clara Whitfield looked at the condemned man she had never met. "Hold steady, Elias Boone. I didn't wear white to watch you hang." Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The rope swayed once in the pale morning wind. Dry Creek stood silent beneath the gallows platform, boots grinding softly in the dust while a gray sky hung low over the town square. Sheriff Dalton cleared his throat. The wood lever creaked under his hand. Elias Boone stood beneath the beam with iron cuffs biting into his wrists, hat gone, dark hair hanging loose against a bruised cheek. No one in the crowd spoke for him. No one stepped forward. A woman's boots struck the wooden steps of the gallows. Slow. Steady. The boards groaned beneath the weight of her climb. White fabric brushed the planks as Clara Whitfield stepped into the cold light wearing a wedding dress meant for another day. Wind lifted the veil across her face. Gasps rippled through the gathered men. Sheriff Dalton's hand froze above the lever. "Clara," he muttered, voice dry as prairie grass. "This ain't your place." Clara Whitfield did not look at the sheriff. Her eyes stayed on the man with the rope around his neck. Elias Boone stared back in quiet confusion, chest rising slowly beneath a worn shirt. The rope creaked again above him. Clara's voice carried across the silent square. "That man is my husband." A murmur spread through the crowd like wind through brittle weeds. Sheriff Dalton's boots scraped the platform. "You don't even know him." "I know the law." Her hand trembled once before she steadied it against the rough wood railing. "Married men cannot hang for a crime without trial." Dalton studied her a long moment. Dust scraped along the ground as the wind pushed through the square. The sheriff finally sighed. The rope loosened. Iron cuffs clinked as Elias Boone lowered his hands. Someone in the crowd spat. Someone else muttered Clara Whitfield had lost her mind. Elias stepped off the gallows beside her. They stood shoulder to shoulder like strangers waiting for a storm. Clara did not meet his eyes. "Walk," she said quietly. Boots thudded against the wooden steps as they descended. The town watched them cross the street. Hinges groaned when the stable door opened. Moments later hooves struck dirt. The ride out of Dry Creek happened in silence. Wind rushed through the open prairie. Fence posts passed like lonely sentinels across the hills. By dusk Clara Whitfield's ranch appeared beyond a stand of cottonwoods. A small house. A tired barn. The gate creaked long and slow when Elias pushed it open. Somewhere in the yard a loose wind chime tapped softly against a nail. Clara dismounted first. Boots crunched over frozen ground. She climbed the porch steps without looking back. The door opened with a tired wooden groan. Warm lamplight spilled into the dark yard. Clara Whitfield stepped inside. After a moment's hesitation, Elias Boone followed her into the house. The door shut behind Elias Boone with a hollow wooden thud. Warm lamplight flickered across the small room. A cast iron stove hummed softly in the corner, fire snapping beneath its black belly. Elias stood near the door, hat in his hands, unsure where to place himself. The rope burn around his neck still stung beneath his collar. Clara Whitfield moved across the room without speaking. Her wedding veil had slipped loose, trailing like tired snow across the floorboards. She removed it and folded the fabric slowly. The only sound in the house was the faint ticking of a wind chime outside the porch. Clink. Clink. Clara set a kettle over the stove. The metal rang softly when it touched the iron. "You can sit," she said. Elias glanced at the table. One chair stood there. The other leaned broken against the wall. He stayed standing. Steam began to whisper from the kettle. Clara filled 2 tin cups. She slid one across the table. The cup scraped the wood with a quiet drag. Elias finally stepped forward. His boots creaked against the old boards. He took the chair slowly, as if the house itself might reject him. They drank in silence. Outside, wind moved across the prairie like a long slow breath. Clara's eyes lifted toward him once. "You planning to run?" Elias shook his head. "No." Her gaze stayed on him a moment longer. "You might want to." He set the tin cup down. The metal tapped softly. "Town doesn't seem fond of me." Clara looked toward the stove. "No," she said quietly. "They aren't." The kettle lid rattled once before settling again. Fire cracked beneath the iron stove. Warmth spread slowly across the room. For the first time since morning, Elias Boone felt his fingers begin to thaw. Clara stood. "The barn roof leaks," she said. "Fence line on the west pasture is down." She gathered the veil again, folding it tighter this time. "You saved your life today." Her eyes met his. "You can repay that by fixing what's broken." Elias nodded once. "That seems fair." Clara pointed toward a narrow hallway. "There's a wash basin in the back room." Her voice remained calm. "But I keep a rifle over the door." The wind chime tapped again outside. Clink. Clink. "If you decide to run," she added quietly, "do it before morning." Elias gave a slow nod. "I won't." She studied him. Something uncertain flickered behind her eyes. Then she turned away. Night settled thick around the ranch. The barn groaned in the wind. Somewhere in the rafters a loose board knocked softly against wood. Elias lay awake on a narrow cot in the back room. The mattress springs creaked when he shifted. He listened to the quiet house breathing around him. The stove fire popped once in the front room. Clara's footsteps moved slowly across the floorboards. Then silence again. Hours passed. Cold pressed against the windows. The wind chime outside tapped in the dark. Clink. 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 Morning arrived pale and gray. Elias stepped outside before the sun broke the horizon. Frost covered the yard. The wind cut sharp across the pasture. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the broken fence. The boards sagged where winter storms had pushed them down. He lifted one rail. The wood groaned. Nails squealed when he hammered them back into place. The sound carried across the empty fields. Bang. 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 From the porch Clara watched quietly. A shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her breath rose in thin clouds. Elias worked without looking toward the house. Hammer striking wood. Fence tightening. Cold morning air filling his lungs. By midday the wind softened. Sunlight slid across the prairie grass. Clara stepped into the yard carrying a bucket of water. The pump squealed when she worked the handle. Elias crossed the yard and took the handle from her. The metal groaned. Water splashed hard into the bucket. Clara stepped back. "You don't have to prove anything." Elias kept pumping. "I'm not proving." The pump squealed again. "I'm staying." The bucket filled. Water sloshed against the rim. Clara studied him. "You don't know what you stepped into yesterday." He wiped his hands against his coat. "I know enough." The wind shifted suddenly. Across the distant hills a faint cloud of dust lifted along the road. Elias noticed it first. A rider. Far away. But moving toward the valley. Clara followed his gaze. Her jaw tightened. "That road leads to Dry Creek." The wind carried the faint echo of hooves. Still distant. Still slow. But coming. Clara lifted the bucket and walked back toward the house. Her boots crunched across the frost. Elias watched the road a moment longer. Then he turned back to the fence. The hammer struck wood again. Bang. Bang. Bang! Warm sunlight settled across the yard. The stove smoke drifted gently from the chimney. Inside the house the wind chime tapped softly against the porch beam. Clink. Clink. For the first time since the gallows, the ranch sounded almost alive. But the dust cloud on the road kept growing. Morning crept slowly across Clara Whitfield's ranch. Frost clung to the fence rails like thin glass. The barn door groaned when Elias Boone pulled it open. Cold air rushed from the dark interior. A restless horse stamped inside. Hooves thudded against packed dirt. Elias stepped in. The animal snorted, breath steaming in the dim light. "Easy," Elias murmured. The horse's ears flicked. His hand moved slowly along its neck. Dust drifted through thin beams of sunlight cutting through the slats. Leather creaked when he lifted the saddle from its peg. Outside, the pump handle squealed. Clara worked it steadily. Water splashed into a metal bucket. The sound carried across the quiet yard. Squeal. Splash. Squeal. Elias stepped out of the barn with the saddle over one shoulder. Cold wind brushed across the pasture. Clara paused when she saw him. "You know horses," she said. Elias set the saddle onto the rail. "Enough to keep one alive." She nodded once. Silence returned between them. A crow cried somewhere over the fields. Clara lifted the bucket. "You eat before work." Inside the house the stove fire had already begun to wake. Wood popped under the iron lid. The smell of coffee drifted across the small kitchen. Elias stepped in slowly. The warmth met him like a wall. He removed his hat. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. Clara placed a skillet onto the stove. Grease hissed when it touched the hot metal. Eggs cracked. The sharp sound broke the quiet room. Elias sat at the table. The chair groaned under his weight. Clara set a plate down in front of him. Tin fork. 2 eggs. A heel of bread. He ate without speaking. Outside the wind chime tapped softly. Clink. Clink. Clara watched him for a moment. "You swing a hammer like a ranch hand." Elias chewed slowly. "Used to be." Her brow tightened. "Used to be where?" He wiped his mouth. "Different valley." The stove cracked loudly. A piece of wood split under the heat. Clara said nothing more. They finished breakfast in silence. Afterward Elias stepped outside again. Sunlight had melted most of the frost. Mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the yard. The barn roof sagged along the far side. He climbed the ladder with a bundle of fresh shingles. The boards creaked beneath his weight. Hammer strikes echoed across the ranch. Bang. 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 Clara worked below. Laundry flapped on the clothesline. Fabric snapped sharply in the wind. From the roof Elias could see far across the prairie. Empty grassland. Rolling hills. And the road from Dry Creek. A faint trail of dust still lingered in the distance. He paused. Listening. Wind over grass. Cloth snapping on a line. No hooves. Yet. The hammer lifted again. Bang. 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 By afternoon the roof held firm. Elias climbed down. Sweat cooled quickly against the wind. Clara stood near the pump rinsing a pan. Water splashed across the dirt. "You work fast," she said. "Storms don't wait." She looked toward the barn. "You planning to stay through winter?" Elias shrugged. "If I'm welcome." Clara's gaze dropped to the ground. For a moment she said nothing. Then she nodded. "You earned your supper tonight." Evening settled gently over the ranch. The sky turned soft gold along the horizon. Inside the house the stove glowed warm. A stew pot simmered quietly. The smell filled the small room. Elias chopped wood near the back door. The axe struck the log with dull thuds. Thok. Thok. Clara set bowls on the table. "To this time." The wind chime tapped again outside. Clink. Clink. Elias paused mid-swing. Something else had reached his ears. Faint. Distant. Hoofbeats. He stepped toward the yard. The wind carried the sound again. Soft but steady. Clara appeared beside him. "You hear it too?" Elias nodded. Both of them watched the far road. A single rider moved slowly across the horizon. The sun burned behind him, turning the figure black against the light. The horse walked. Not rushing. Not hiding. Just coming. Clara's fingers tightened around the porch railing. "That road only leads here." Elias rested the axe head against the ground. The rider stopped far off near the ridge. Watching. Waiting. The wind lifted dust around the horse's legs. Then the rider turned slowly. Hooves carried him back the way he came. Silence returned to the valley. But it felt different now. Heavier. Clara exhaled quietly. "Someone knows where you are." Elias looked toward the fading dust. "Looks that way." The wind chime struck once more in the growing dark. Clink. Clink. Inside the house the stew bubbled softly. Warmth spread through the small rooms. But outside the prairie had started listening. Night settled heavy over the ranch. Cold crept through the boards of the house. Outside the prairie wind brushed softly through dry grass. Inside, the stove glowed red behind its iron door. Stew simmered low in the pot. Clara Whitfield stirred it slowly. The wooden spoon scraped the edge of the pot. Soft. Steady. Across the room Elias Boone sat at the table mending a broken bridle strap. Leather creaked between his hands. The needle pushed through thick hide. Tap. Pull. Tap. Pull. The house felt warmer than it had the night before. Not quiet, but settled. Clara ladled stew into 2 bowls. Steam curled upward in slow white ribbons. She placed 1 bowl before him. The table legs scraped softly across the floor. Elias nodded once. "Thank you." They ate while the wind moved outside. The wind chime tapped lightly against the porch beam. Clink. Clink. Clara watched him between bites. "You ever hang before?" Elias paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "No." "You looked calm." He lowered the spoon. "Nothing calm about a rope." The stove popped loudly. A spark clattered against the iron. Clara studied the table a moment. "You didn't fight." Elias shrugged. "Sometimes fighting doesn't help." Silence filled the room again. Only the spoon against the bowl. Only the quiet hiss of the stove. After supper Elias stood. The chair groaned beneath him. "I'll check the barn." Clara nodded. "Horse gets restless when the wind turns." Outside the cold struck hard. Frost had begun creeping across the yard again. The barn door groaned when Elias opened it. Inside, the horse shifted in its stall. Hooves thudded softly. He hung the lantern from a nail. Golden light swung gently through the rafters. Dust floated through the glow. The horse snorted once. Elias stroked its neck. "Easy." The animal calmed. Wind slipped through the barn boards with a long hollow whistle. He stepped toward the saddle rack. Something small caught the lantern light. A silver flash. Elias reached into the saddlebag. Metal clinked softly in his hand. A worn silver token. Its edges scratched from years of use. He turned it slowly under the lantern. A crest carved into the surface. A crown over crossed brands. The mark of Victor Harrow. The richest landowner in the valley. Elias stared at it a long moment. The horse shifted again. Outside the wind grew stronger. The barn door rattled on its hinges. Elias slipped the token back into the saddlebag. Then he froze. Footsteps. Soft. Outside the barn. Boots on frost. He lowered the lantern flame slightly. The light dimmed. A shadow passed across the crack beneath the door. Someone stood outside, listening. The horse stamped. Elias moved silently toward the wall where a long wooden rake leaned. The footsteps lingered, then drifted away slowly through the yard. Crunch. 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 After a moment, Elias pushed the door open. Cold air rushed in. The yard stood empty. Moonlight stretched pale across the pasture. The wind chime moved gently. Clink. Clink. No riders. No voices. Just the wide silent prairie. But fresh boot tracks crossed the frozen ground. Elias followed them a few steps. They led toward the road and vanished into the dark. He returned to the house slowly. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him again. Clara looked up from the table. "You were gone a while." He closed the door. Wind rattled it once before settling. Someone walked through the yard. Her hand stilled. "You sure?" Elias nodded. "Tracks by the barn." The stove popped again. The room suddenly felt smaller. Clara stood. Her chair scraped sharply against the floor. "I told you that Ryder wasn't just passing through." Elias walked to the window. The glass rattled faintly in the wind. The prairie beyond remained dark and still. "They're watching." Clara folded her arms tight against the cold creeping through the walls. "Why?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His hand moved slowly into his coat pocket. He placed the silver token on the table. Metal touched wood with a quiet click. Clara leaned closer. The firelight flickered across the carved crest. Her breath caught. "That brand." Elias nodded. "Victor Harrow." The wind pressed against the house again. The porch boards groaned. Clara looked from the token to Elias. "You worked for him." "Once. And now his men are walking through my yard." Silence stretched between them. The stew pot bubbled softly on the stove. Warmth from the fire touched their faces. But cold pressed against every wall. Clara picked up the silver token. The metal looked heavy in her hand. "You didn't steal this." Elias met her eyes. "No." "Then why were they hanging you?" The wind chime tapped outside. Clink. Clink. Elias looked toward the dark window. "Because someone like Harrow doesn't let men walk away." The fire cracked loudly inside the stove. Outside, the prairie wind kept moving across the land. And somewhere beyond the hills, someone was still watching the ranch. Morning came hard and pale across the valley. Cold light slid through the thin curtains. The stove had burned low during the night. Ash shifted softly when Clara Whitfield opened the iron door. She fed 2 logs into the coals. Wood caught slowly. Crack. Pop. Warmth crept back into the small kitchen. Elias Boone sat at the table, sharpening a knife against a whetstone. The blade whispered along the stone. "SHHK. SHHK." Neither of them had slept much. Outside, the prairie wind had finally settled. The wind chime rested silent. Clara poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The kettle hissed faintly on the stove. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. Elias kept the blade moving. "Men who watch from the dark usually do." She set the cup beside him. Tin touched wood with a dull tap. The quiet house seemed to listen. Then hooves sounded on the road. Slow. Deliberate. Elias stopped sharpening. The blade hovered above the stone. Clara's eyes lifted toward the window. Hoofbeats grew louder. Crunch of gravel. Leather creaked outside. Someone dismounted. Boots stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under the weight. A heavy knock struck the door. Thud. Thud. Clara glanced at Elias. He nodded once. She opened the door. Cold air swept into the room. Sheriff Dalton stood there, hat pulled low against the morning sun. His coat carried road dust. The badge on his chest caught the light. "Morning, Clara." His eyes slid past her toward the kitchen table. They landed on Elias Boone. Dalton stepped inside slowly. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. "You've been busy," the sheriff said, glancing at the repaired fence through the window. Elias set the knife down. "I don't like idle hands." Dalton's jaw tightened slightly. He removed his hat. Wind pushed against the door behind him. "I didn't come for small talk." Clara closed the door. The latch clicked softly. "What did you come for then?" Dalton stepped closer to the table. His voice lowered. "Victor Harrow knows that hanging didn't happen." The stove popped behind them. Heat pressed against the back of the room. Clara crossed her arms. "That his problem?" Dalton shook his head slowly. "No." He looked directly at Elias. "That's your problem." Elias leaned back in the chair. Wood creaked under his weight. "Thought it might be." Dalton rested both hands on the table. His fingers spread against the worn surface. "Harrow claims you stole something from him." Elias said nothing. Dalton continued. "Something important enough he's offering money to anyone who brings you back." Clara's chair scraped across the floor. "You let them try hanging him already." Dalton's eyes flicked toward her. "You stopped that." The wind rattled the window frame. Silence pressed against the room. Dalton reached into his coat. Paper rustled. He laid a folded document on the table. The parchment crackled softly. "Legal claim." Clara picked it up. Her eyes moved across the ink. Her face hardened. "He can't claim my land," Dalton sighed. "He says your ranch carries a debt to his cattle company." Clara slammed the paper down. Wood thudded loudly. "That's a lie." Dalton didn't argue. "Maybe." He looked again at Elias. "But Harrow owns the judge in Dry Creek." The wind chime tapped faintly outside. Clink. Clink. Elias rubbed a thumb across the edge of the table. "What does Harrow really want?" Dalton answered without hesitation. "You." The word hung in the air. Heavy. Cold. Clara's eyes moved from the sheriff to Elias. Dalton stepped back. His boots creaked across the boards. "I came to give warning, not trouble." He placed his hat back on. "Riders are already asking questions." Clara followed him to the door. "You planning to help them?" Dalton paused at the threshold. Cold wind pushed against the opening. "I'm planning to stay alive." He stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned again. Elias watched from the table as the sheriff mounted his horse. Leather creaked. Rain snapped softly. Dalton looked back once. "You should leave the valley, Boone." Elias didn't move. Dalton shook his head slowly. Then he rode off down the road. Hooves faded into the distance. Silence returned to the ranch. Clara closed the door. The latch clicked. Inside, the stove cracked loudly. Heat pushed back against the cold. She walked slowly back to the table. The paper still lay there. Victor Harrow's seal stamped deep into the wax. Clara pressed her palm flat against it. "He wants my land too." Elias stood. The chair legs scraped across the floor. "He wants control." Clara looked toward the window. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and empty. But the wind had begun rising again. The chime tapped softly. Clink. Clink. Elias picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the ink. Then he folded it slowly. "If Harrow's coming," he said quietly, "he won't send just one rider next time." Clara's gaze hardened. "Then we won't be waiting quietly." Outside, the wind pushed harder across the yard. The barn door rattled once. And somewhere far down the road, dust began rising again. The wind changed that evening. It came colder. Sharper. It slid through the cracks of the ranch house and whispered along the floorboards. Clara Whitfield pushed another log into the stove. The fire answered with a dry crack. Warmth pushed slowly across the room. Elias Boone sat near the window with the rifle resting across his knees. The wood stock creaked softly when he shifted. Outside, the prairie darkened under thick clouds. No stars. Only the faint silver line of the road. Clara stirred a pot of beans. The spoon scraped the iron slowly. "You expecting them tonight?" Elias watched the window. "Men like Harrow don't rush." The wind rattled the glass once. Clara set the spoon down. "Then why does it feel like they're already here?" Elias didn't answer. "Because it did." Silence stretched across the room. Then the wind chime outside moved. Clink. Clink. Elias leaned forward. Listening. Not wind. Hooves. Slow. Far away. But real. Clara heard it too. Her hand froze on the stove lid. "How many?" Elias stood and stepped onto the porch. Cold air struck his face. The prairie lay black beneath the clouds. Across the ridge, faint shapes moved against the horizon. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Their horses walked slowly along the road. Watching. Not approaching. Not leaving. Just circling the valley like wolves studying a fence. Elias returned inside. Clara looked up. "Riders. How many?" "Enough to watch." The stove popped loudly. Firelight flickered across the walls. Clara folded her arms tight. "They want us nervous." Elias nodded once. "They'll get bored if we panic." Outside, the riders continued their slow circle. Hooves muffled in the distant grass. The sound faded. Then returned again an hour later. Always out there. Always watching. Night grew deeper. Cold thickened against the house. Elias fed the stove again. The iron door clanged shut. Warmth pushed back against the creeping chill. Clara poured coffee. The kettle hissed softly. She slid a cup toward him. "You ever deal with men like Harrow before?" Elias took the cup. "Too many." "Did you win?" He blew across the coffee. Steam curled upward. "Still breathing." Clara watched him carefully. "That doesn't answer my question." Elias set the cup down. Tin-tapped wood. "Men like him don't stop until someone makes them." Silence followed. The wind pressed harder against the house. The barn door banged once in the distance. Clara flinched slightly. Elias stood. "I'll check it." Outside, the cold had sharpened. Frost glittered across the yard under the dim lantern glow from the porch. The barn door swung slowly in the wind. Groan. Groan. Elias crossed the yard. His boots crunched against frozen ground. Inside the barn, the horse stamped nervously. Hooves thudded against the stall. "Easy," Elias murmured. He latched the door shut. The wind pushed hard against the wood. Then he heard something else. A laugh. Low. From the darkness beyond the barn. Elias stepped slowly toward the opening. The night swallowed the pasture. But the faint glow of a cigarette burned in the distance. A man sat on horseback near the fence line. Watching. The ember flared once. Then faded. Elias said nothing. The rider tipped his hat slowly. Then turned his horse. Hooves moved softly through the grass. Gone again. But close. Too close. Elias returned to the house. Clara stood waiting by the door. "You saw someone?" He nodded. "One of Harrow's men." Her jaw tightened. "What did he want?" "To remind us they're here." The stove cracked loudly again. Warm light flickered across the small kitchen. Clara stepped closer to the window. She stared into the dark prairie. "They'll keep circling until we break." Elias leaned the rifle against the wall. "Maybe." Clara turned toward him. "You planning to leave?" The question hung between them. Heavy. Elias looked around the room. The stove fire. The quiet table. The warm lamplight filling the house. Then he looked at Clara. No. Outside the wind chime tapped again. Clink. Clink. The sound carried softly across the yard. But now another sound joined it. Hooves again. More this time. Closer. Clara moved to the window. Dark shapes appeared along the far ridge. 5 riders now. Maybe 6. Their silhouettes stood still against the moonless sky. Watching the ranch. Waiting. The barn shifted in the wind. The house creaked quietly. Clara's voice lowered. They're not going away. Elias picked up the rifle. Wood creaked in his hands. No. Outside, the riders remained motionless in the dark. The prairie held its breath. And the night around Clara Whitfield's ranch grew colder still. Morning arrived under a lid of gray clouds. Cold hung low across the valley. The riders still waited on the ridge. Their horses stood like dark posts against the pale sky. Clara Whitfield watched them from the porch. A shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The wind chime tapped slowly beside the door. Clink. Clink. Behind her the stove crackled inside the house. Warmth pressed softly through the open doorway. Elias Boone stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. Steam curled upward into the cold air. He followed Clara's gaze toward the ridge. They stayed all night, she said. Elias nodded. Men like that get paid by patience. One of the riders moved. The horse turned down the slope. Then another. Dust lifted slowly along the road. Clara's grip tightened on the railing. They're coming. Elias set the mug down. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. 4 riders approached the ranch. Not rushing. Not hiding. Their horses walked slow and confident through the pasture grass. Leather creaked. Spurs jingled faintly. The wind carried the sound across the yard. The lead rider wore a dark coat and a wide hat pulled low. His horse stopped near the gate. The others spread behind him like a loose wall. Clara stepped down from the porch. Boots touched the frozen ground. Elias followed a step behind. The wind brushed across the pasture. The rider lifted his head. Victor Harrow. His face looked carved from stone. Clean beard. Sharp eyes that studied the ranch like a man measuring timber. Well now, Harrow said softly. His voice carried across the yard. Nice little place you've got here, Mrs. Whitfield. Clara said nothing. Harrow swung down from the saddle. His boots landed with a heavy thud. The gate creaked when he pushed it open. Elias shifted slightly beside Clara. Harrow noticed. His eyes flicked toward Elias Boone. A faint smile touched his mouth. There you are. The wind chime moved again. Clink. Clink. Harrow walked slowly into the yard. His men remained near the gate. Hands resting easy near their holsters. The barn door rattled once in the wind. Harrow stopped a few paces from Clara. I hear you've taken in a stray. Clara's voice stayed calm. He works here. Harrow chuckled softly. That so? His gaze moved across the ranch. The repaired fence. The patched roof. The barn standing solid against the wind. You've been busy, Boone. Elias said nothing. Harrow reached into his coat. Paper rustled. He held up a folded document. The parchment cracked in the cold air. This land carries debt, Harrow said. My cattle company holds the claim. Clara didn't reach for the paper. That claim is false. Harrow shrugged slightly. Maybe. He waved the document lightly. But the judge in Dry Creek seems to disagree. The wind picked up across the yard. Dust scraped along the ground. Harrow's men shifted in their saddles. One horse snorted. Clara stepped forward. Her boots pressed hard into the dirt. You didn't ride all this way for paperwork. Harrow's eyes glinted. No. His gaze turned toward Elias Boone. I came for him. Silence settled across the ranch. The stove popped faintly inside the house. Warm smoke drifted from the chimney. Elias stepped slightly ahead of Clara. "You've said that before." Harrow nodded. "And I'll say it again." He pointed toward the road. "Ride with us now." His voice stayed smooth. "Walk away from this ranch." Clara's breath fogged in the cold air. "And if he doesn't?" Harrow's smile vanished. His eyes turned flat. "Then the debt comes due." He gestured slowly across the land. "My men will start collecting." The wind slammed the barn door once. Bang! Clara didn't move. "You touch this ranch," she said quietly, "you answer to me." Harrow looked almost amused. "You?" His men chuckled behind him. The sound grated against the quiet valley. Harrow stepped closer. Close enough now that Elias could see the small scar along his jaw. "You think marriage papers protect you?" Clara didn't step back. "You think money owns everything?" The wind chime rang harder now. Clink. 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 Harrow steadied her face. Then he turned toward Elias. "That token you carry belongs to me." Elias said nothing. Harrow's voice dropped. "You know what it proves." The air seemed to tighten. Elias held Harrow's gaze. "I know." Harrow's smile returned slowly. "Then you know why you're coming with me." Clara's hand moved. Not to Elias. To the rifle leaning against the porch post. The wood creaked when she lifted it. Harrow's men straightened in their saddles. Hands drifted toward holsters. Cold wind swept across the yard. Dust swirled around their boots. Clara's voice stayed steady. "He stays." Harrow looked at the rifle. Then back at her. His smile faded. "Careful, Mrs. Whitfield." Clara didn't lower the barrel. "Leave." Silence filled the ranch. Long. Heavy. Then Harrow tipped his hat slightly. He stepped backward. His boots crunched against the dirt. "This isn't finished." He turned toward his horse. Leather creaked when he climbed into the saddle. The riders gathered behind him. Harrow looked once more toward the ranch house. Smoke rising from the chimney. The wind chime ringing softly in the cold. Then he pulled the reins. His horse turned toward the road. The riders followed. Hooves thudded across the frozen ground. Dust lifted behind them. Clara lowered the rifle slowly. The wind moved through the empty yard. Clink. Clink. Elias watched the riders disappear beyond the ridge. His voice came quiet. "He won't stop." Clara rested the rifle against the porch. Her jaw set hard. "Then neither will we." Night fell early over the valley. Clouds rolled low across the hills. Cold wind slid across the pasture and pressed against the walls of Clara Whitfield's ranch house. Inside, the stove burned hard. Flames cracked and spat behind the iron door. Elias Boone sat at the table cleaning the rifle. Metal clicked softly. Oil rubbed into the barrel. Across from him Clara loaded cartridges into a small wooden box. Each brass round tapped the table. Tap. 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 The house felt smaller tonight. Tighter. Outside the wind chime moved in restless circles. Clink. 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 Clara slid the last cartridge into place. "How many do you think he'll bring?" Elias worked the bolt of the rifle. The steel slid smooth. "Enough to feel certain." Clara looked toward the dark window. "That many?" "Men like Harrow don't come twice unless they plan to finish." The wind slammed the barn door once. Bang! Both of them turned their heads. Elias stood. He stepped onto the porch. Cold air bit deep into his lungs. The prairie lay black beneath the storm clouds. Then he saw them. Lanterns. Small orange dots drifting across the road. Moving slowly toward the ranch. More than before. 8. Maybe 10 riders. Their horses walked steady through the grass. No hurry now. The hunt had begun. Elias stepped back inside. "They're coming." Clara lifted the rifle, leaning against the wall. Wood creaked in her hands. The stove popped loudly behind them. Warmth fought against the cold pouring through the door. How long? Minutes. She moved quickly. Lantern blown out. Curtains pulled tight. The room dimmed to firelight. Elias loaded the rifle. The click of each round sounded sharp in the quiet. Clara handed him the cartridge box. Outside, the first hoofbeats reached the yard. Slow. Deliberate. Leather creaked. Spurs jingled faintly. The riders spread out around the house. One horse snorted near the fence. Another rider dismounted. Boots struck frozen ground. Crunch. Crunch. A voice called from the dark. "Victor Harrow." "Evening, Mrs. Whitfield." The wind carried his voice across the porch. "Last chance." Clara stood near the door. The rifle steady in her hands. "You already heard my answer." Harrow chuckled. A low sound that drifted through the yard. Pity. The barn door slammed again in the wind. Then silence. For one long breath the prairie held still. Then a window shattered. Glass burst across the floor. Clara fired first. The rifle cracked through the night. A rider shouted outside. Hooves thrashed against the ground. Elias moved to the side window. Another shot split the dark. A lantern fell outside. Firelight spilled across the yard. Shadows jumped along the barn wall. More riders rushed forward. Boots pounded across the porch. The door shook beneath a heavy kick. Thud. Thud. Elias fired through the broken window. A horse screamed and bolted across the pasture. Gunfire echoed across the valley. Sharp. Violent. Smoke filled the small room. Clara reloaded quickly, her hands steady. Another crash struck the door. The hinges groaned. Elias grabbed the axe near the stove. He moved beside the door. Clara fired again through the shattered glass. A rider fell from his saddle. The horse thundered away riderless. Outside, Harrow's voice barked orders. "Take the barn." Hooves pounded toward the side yard. Elias kicked the door open suddenly. The wind burst inside with a roar. He stepped onto the porch and fired once. The rifle blast lit the dark. A man dropped near the gate. Another rider turned his horse away fast. Elias ducked back inside as bullets tore splinters from the porch rail. Wood cracked. Dust filled the air. Clara shoved another rifle into his hands. Left side. Boots rushed along the barn wall. Elias moved to the window again. He fired once. Twice. The echoes rolled across the hills. Outside, the riders began pulling back. Their confidence shaken now. One lantern still burned near the gate. In its glow, Victor Harrow sat tall on his horse. Watching. Waiting. Elias stepped onto the porch again. The rifle rested steady against his shoulder. "Go home, Harrow." The wind howled across the yard. Harrow didn't move. Then he slowly raised one hand. His remaining riders pulled their horses back toward the road. Hooves churned through the dirt. The lantern near the gate flickered in the wind. Harrow looked toward Clara standing in the doorway. Rifle in her hands. Firelight behind her. "You think this ends tonight?" Clara didn't answer. The wind chime swung wildly beside the porch. Clink. 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 Harrow turned his horse. The riders followed him into the dark valley. Hoofbeats faded slowly into the storm. Silence returned to the ranch. Broken glass covered the floor. Smoke drifted through the open doorway. Clara lowered the rifle. Her hands trembled now. Just slightly. Elias stepped down from the porch. The cold wind washed across the yard. He looked toward the distant road where the riders had vanished. "They'll come back," he said quietly. Behind him, the stove cracked inside the house. warmth still alive within the walls. Clara stepped beside him, her voice calm again. "Then we'll still be here." Morning came slowly after the long night. Gray light slipped across the broken glass on the kitchen floor. Cold air drifted through the shattered window. The stove burned low but steady. Clara Whitfield knelt beside the hearth and fed another log into the coals. The fire answered with a dry crack. Warmth pushed gently across the room again. Elias Boone stood near the doorway watching the quiet yard. Smoke curled from the barn roof. The horse shifted inside the stall. Hooves thudded softly. Outside the prairie looked untouched. But the ground near the gate carried deep hoof marks from the night before. Clara swept glass into a metal pan. The pieces rattled sharply. "You're bleeding." Elias looked down. A thin cut ran along his forearm. He wiped it with a rag. "Just splinters." The broom rasped against the floorboards. Clara kept sweeping. "They lost men last night?" Elias nodded once. "Two I saw." The wind moved across the pasture. The wind chime tapped softly outside again. Clink. Clink. Clara dumped the glass into the stove. The shards hissed against the hot iron. Then she looked toward him. "They'll come again." "Maybe." "You don't sound certain." Elias stepped inside and closed the door. The latch clicked. They didn't get what they came for. Clara leaned the broom against the wall. "Then they'll keep trying." Silence hung between them. Only the fire popping behind the stove door. Elias walked to the table. His hand slipped inside his coat. The silver token landed softly on the wood. Click. Clara looked down at it again. The crest glowed faintly in the firelight. "You said that proves something." Elias nodded. "It proves Harrow's been stealing land." Clara frowned. "How?" Elias pulled a folded packet from his coat. The paper crackled when he opened it. Maps. Names. Debt ledgers written in careful ink. He spread them across the table. The edges brushed softly against the wood. "These are ranch claims." Clara stepped closer. Her finger followed the lines. "Half this valley." Elias nodded again. "Harrow lent money to ranchers during the drought." Clara read the figures. "They couldn't pay. He made sure they couldn't." The fire cracked louder. Clara's eyes lifted slowly. "You worked for him?" "Ranch foreman." Her voice lowered. "You helped him take this land?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Outside, the wind rose slightly across the pasture. The barn door creaked. Finally he spoke. "At first I thought it was business." Clara steadied his face. "When did you learn the truth?" Elias tapped the silver token. His brand inspectors carried these. The metal rang softly under his finger. They marked every ranch Harrow planned to take. Clara's breath slowed. "And you stole one?" Elias shook his head. "I kept the records." He tapped the ledgers. "These prove every claim was forced." The room fell quiet again. Only the low simmer of the stove. Clara leaned against the table. If Dry Creek saw this, Harrow would lose half his land. The wind chime rang again outside. Clink. Clink. Clara looked toward the window. "You should have shown this before they tried hanging you." Elias folded the papers slowly. "I tried." Her brow tightened. "What happened?" "Sheriff arrested me before I reached the judge." Clara's jaw set hard. "Harrow bought him." "Probably." Silence settled again. Then a distant sound carried through the morning air. Hooves. Faint. But growing closer. Clara moved to the window. A single rider approached along the road. Dust rose behind the horse. Elias stepped beside her. "Dalton." The sheriff rode slowly into the yard. His horse looked tired. Leather creaked when he dismounted. Boots struck the ground. Crunch. Crunch. Clara opened the door before he knocked. Cold air rushed inside. Dalton removed his hat. His eyes moved across the room. Broken glass. Bullet holes in the wall. The rifle leaning against the table. You held them off. Elias said nothing. Dalton stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. I counted the riders heading back to Harrow's ranch. His voice lowered. He lost men. Clara crossed her arms. He started it. Dalton noticed the papers on the table. What's that? Elias pushed the ledgers toward him. Paper slid softly across the wood. Dalton read quietly. The room grew still. The fire cracked once. His face changed. You're serious? Elias nodded. This is why Harrow wants me. Dalton rubbed a hand across his beard. If the town sees this. Clara finished the thought. He loses everything. Dalton looked toward the door. The wind chime tapped gently outside. Clink. Clink. Then he looked back at Elias. You planning to show it? Elias folded the papers again. Yes. Dalton exhaled slowly. That'll start a war. Clara stepped closer to the table. Her voice steady. Then it's time someone started it. Outside the prairie wind moved across the land again. But inside the small ranch house the truth had finally found its voice. Spring arrived slowly across the valley. Snowmelt ran through the shallow creek beyond Clara Whitfield's pasture. Grass pushed up through the thawing earth. Morning sunlight slipped across the ranch house windows. Inside, the stove burned steady. Wood cracked softly beneath the iron lid. Warmth filled the kitchen. Clara stood at the table kneading bread dough. Flour dusted her hands. The wooden bowl scraped softly against the table. Across the room Elias Boone repaired a saddle strap. Leather creaked beneath his fingers. The quiet felt different now. Not empty. Peaceful. Outside the wind chime tapped gently against the porch beam. Clink. Clink. The door opened. Warm sunlight spilled across the floorboards. Sheriff Dalton stepped inside. His boots carried dry spring dust now instead of frost. He removed his hat slowly. You were right, he said. Clara wiped her hands on a cloth. About Harrow? Dalton nodded. Judge saw the ledgers. He rested both hands on the table. Town council took his land claims. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Only the low pop of the stove. Elias looked up from the saddle. And Harrow? Dalton exhaled. Packed his wagons 2 days ago. Clara's shoulders loosened slightly. Dalton smiled faintly. Men like him don't like sunlight. Outside a wagon rattled down the distant road. Voices carried faintly across the fields. Families returning to their ranches. Clara stepped to the doorway. The valley looked alive again. Smoke rising from chimneys. Cattle moving through open pasture. Dalton replaced his hat. You two started something here. Elias shook his head slightly. Truth started it. Dalton tipped his hat and stepped back outside. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. The door closed softly behind him. Inside the ranch house the warmth settled again. Clara finished shaping the bread loaf. She slid it into the oven. Iron clanged when the door shut. Elias stood and stretched. The saddle now hung whole on the rack. You planning to keep the dress? Clara glanced toward the small hook near the wall. The white wedding dress still hung there. Clean now. Folded carefully. Her lips curved slightly. It saved a man's life. Elias walked closer. And started a marriage. She studied him a moment. You still feel like a stranger? He shook his head slowly. Not anymore. Outside the horse whinnied near the fence. Hooves thudded softly across the yard. The barn door opened with a long wooden groan. Elias stepped outside. Warm spring air wrapped around the ranch. The valley stretched bright beneath the sun. A young ranch boy rode along the road carrying supplies. He lifted a hand in greeting. Elias nodded back. Clara joined him on the porch. The wind moved gently through the cottonwood trees. The wind chime stirred again. Clink. Clink. Not sharp now. Not restless. Just soft. The sound drifted across the yard. Clara leaned against the railing. Hard to believe this place nearly burned down in one night. Elias looked across the fields. New fence rails stood straight. The barn roof held strong. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. "Storms pass," he said. Clara turned toward him. "You planning to stay when the next one comes?" Elias smiled faintly. "I already did." The bread inside the oven began to rise. Warm smell drifted through the open doorway. Clara breathed it in. "That smells like home." Elias rested his hands on the porch rail. The sun warmed the wood beneath his palms. For a moment neither of them spoke. The valley carried new sounds now. Cattle lowing in distant pastures. Wagon wheels rolling across the road. Children laughing somewhere beyond the hills. Life returning. Clara reached up and gently steadied the wind chime when the breeze grew stronger. It rang once more. Clink. Clink. The same sound that had greeted a condemned man walking through her gate months before. Only now it carried something different. Not warning. Not loneliness. Just the quiet promise of a place that had become a home. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.